Good morning, and thank you for joining me for the next 10 minutes or so to discuss the COVID vaccine and hopefully provide you with the facts so you can make an educated and hopefully a rational decision about whether to get the vaccine or not. It is now late May 2021, and unfortunately in the US we are still recording between 20 and 30,000 new COVID cases every day. And even in Spokane County for the past few days, we've been recording more than 200 new cases every day. In about 6 months, we'll be heading into winter, and at that time, there will likely only be two groups of people, the vaccinated and the infected, or soon to be infected. And that's because at that time, the virus will likely still be endemic. It'll be everywhere in the community. And there'll likely be few people still wearing masks at that time and probably no social distancing. So really the only way other than vaccination to avoid getting infected would be to walk around with an N95 for the next few years. Unfortunately, in the US, 1 in 4 adults still are not planning on getting the vaccine. And the reasons cited for this include concerns over safety and side effects. Some don't trust the government, particularly the speed of development and rollout. And up to a third still believe they don't really need it because COVID-19 is really not that bad. So to make this decision about whether to get vaccinated or not requires some rational decision making, and this requires a risk-benefit analysis that depends on knowing the facts. And unfortunately, this is not that easy. Finding the true facts versus untruths is not that easy. And we struggle to keep emotion and recently particularly politics out of this decision. Unfortunately, as you all know, we live now in an age of disinformation, and it can really be difficult to separate out fact from fiction. And my purpose today is to hopefully provide you some facts that are unbiased and hopefully give you enough information so you can make a rational decision regarding this important topic. Like all biological organisms, the main evolutionary pressure on the virus is to propagate and spread. And it does this by invading the cell, taking over the machinery of the cell and making endless copies of itself. This leads to cell damage and can lead to cell death either because of the virus or because of the immune system's attack on the cell containing the virus. And worst case, this can lead to death of the host. To understand how these vaccines work, we have to review some basic cell biology. Depicted here is a human cell, and the most important part of this cell is the nucleus, which is the light blue dot. And this contains the DNA, which is the code to the entire organism, in this case a human being. It determines your eye color, your hair color, your height, and also codes for every single one of the 20,000 proteins that makes the cell operate. This DNA is very important to protect, and it is sequestered in the cell. It cannot get out, and nothing can attack the DNA within the nucleus. But in order for this code to get into the cytoplasm where the cell machinery is to make the proteins, it has to send this code out. And this is done through a strand of mRNA or messenger RNA, which sends the message of the code into the cytoplasm for production of proteins. This cartoon of the SARS-CoV-2 virus depicts the two most important parts that we'll discuss. One part is the strand of mRNA within the virus that codes for the virus, and the second part is the spikes on the outside of the virus, which is how the virus attaches to cells. So if we were to think about developing a vaccine against this virus, there's really three different ways of contemplating doing this. One would be to take the whole virus and attenuate or weaken the virus and then inject that into the host to generate an immune response, hoping that the weakened virus would actually not attack the host. And that has been done in the past, but it takes a lot of time because these viruses need to be repeatedly cultured to weaken the virus, and that can take years. The second way would be to just use a portion of the virus and inject that into the host. So for example, if you could break off a piece of that spike and inject that into the host, you could generate an immune response. But that's very hard to do because these are very tiny particles, and even slight damage to the spike would cause the immune system to recognize something different to the true virus. The third way, which is what these mRNA vaccines utilize, is to actually allow the body to make a piece of the virus through use of a sequence of the virus's code that codes for that particular piece. For example, using just a piece of the virus genome that codes for the spike. And we artificially produce that sequence of mRNA in a lab and inject that into the host. The part of the genome that's circled there is the part of the gene that codes for the spike protein, and that makes up about 12% of the total viral genetic code. And again, what you'd have is just a sequence, looks like an alphabet soup, that codes for the amino acids that make up that spike protein. And this was identified fairly early on, and this is actually the exact sequence. You can see it's just a series of base pairs, and this again codes for just the spike protein in the virus. This piece of mRNA, which again is synthetically made in the lab, it's not actually from the virus. This synthetically made mRNA that codes for the spike is injected into the body as a vaccine. This piece of mRNA finds its way into the cell, but not into the nucleus. It stays in the cytoplasm of the cell and then uses the human cell's machinery to translate this piece of mRNA and actually produce a piece of spike protein. So again, important to emphasize that no other parts of the virus are made. It's just the spike protein that's coded for, and the mRNA that's injected into the body is not part of the virus. It's synthetically produced mRNA that just uses the sequence of the virus to generate an identical spike protein. And this is what it looks like 3D. It's a very complex strand of amino acids forming a very complex protein with very specific geometry, which the cell or the human immune system recognizes as foreign. And it's recognized by multiple components of the immune system and generates antibodies that are depicted here that bind to the spike protein on the virus and prevents the virus from binding to the human receptor cell, typically in the lung. So if we think about acquiring long-term immunity, there's really only two ways to do that. One is through natural infection, and the second way is through vaccination. So when considering whether to expose yourself to the natural infection route, we have to consider the consequences of getting infected with COVID-19. And obviously the main endpoint that has received most focus is death or ICU admission, and this is what has made headlines. And obviously it's not inconsequential. This is very common. 1 in 80 people infected on average would either die or require ICU admission. Now, a lot of young people have rightly pointed out that their risk of death or serious illness is much lower than that figure, and that is true. But unfortunately, there are many other consequences that are commonly seen even in young, healthy people. A long COVID, which basically means 6 months of a variety of symptoms attributed to the initial infection, is seen in 10% of infections, and this can occur even if the initial infection was asymptomatic in a young and fairly healthy person. And you only have to see one of these patients in your clinic still suffering from the consequences 6 months later to realize this is a pretty serious consequence. There have also been neuropsychiatric complications reported in a quarter of patients lasting up to a year after the initial infection, and unfortunately also not uncommon in young and otherwise healthy people. Just like with the original SARS-CoV-1 from 12 years ago, it appears that the future risk of diabetes is increased about 50% from what it would have been otherwise for that individual. And again, this appears, at least with SARS-CoV-1, to last beyond 10 years. And a recent publication from England looking at a very large sample of patients who were discharged from hospital after COVID suggests that the future death rate may be increased up to 50% of what it would have been otherwise in patients who survived the initial COVID infection. And all of these consequences may be a result of long-term permanent damage to the mitochondria of the body, which plays a very important role in metabolic health. Despite the impression you may get from TV and the newspapers, we really do not have any blockbuster drugs available to treat COVID once you are infected. Dexamethasone, which is a strong steroid, does help if you get really sick once you're hospitalized, but it's not without side effects and adverse effects. And particularly recently in India, with their humid environment, there have been quite a few cases of mucormycosis, otherwise known as black fungus, which is a very serious and potentially fatal fungal infection that often affects mucous membranes and often ends up invading the brain and kills more than half people affected by it. Even remdesivir, which made a lot of headlines, is not that effective. And in fact, the World Health Organization recently recommended against routine use of remdesivir in hospitalized patients. So let's move on to the actual vaccines. Most Americans are going to get one of the two available mRNA vaccines, either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, and they're both very similar, using the same technology. The results really are very impressive. They appear to be 95% effective at preventing infection as well as asymptomatic transmission. They are free. Side effects, which we'll discuss just now, are infrequent and really minor, lasting less than 24 hours. And there's been no signal of any major side effects. The short-term side effects include fever, headache, fatigue, and sometimes GI distress. And although some people obviously are uncomfortable with this, they may have an uncomfortable night. This typically lasts less than 24 hours and occur in the minority of people, and there are really no long-term consequences from this. Really a small price to pay considering the efficacy of this vaccine. Long-term, nothing adverse has been reported after more than 100 million vaccinations in the US and similar numbers in Europe. And we almost have 1 year of trial data from the initial enrollment of the first patients with really no signal of any adverse effects. With previous vaccines and previous side effects from vaccines like Guillain-Barré or transverse myelitis, these are usually evident within about 2 months of use. So really any signal of bad side effects would have been evident by now. The other group of vaccines, the adenovirus vector vaccines like the AstraZeneca and the J&J vaccines, use, again, a different technology. They actually use an attenuated adenovirus, and as everyone's aware, there have been side effects reported with these, particularly and most concerning, cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. This is pretty rare. With the AstraZeneca vaccine, 1 in 100,000 patients. With J&J, 1 in a million. These typically are more common in women in their 40s and 50s, and is likely related to the adenovirus used in these vaccines. And although it's scary, it's still 3 orders of magnitude greater benefit with these vaccines in preventing COVID than risk. Again, it's important to emphasize that this side effect is just with the adenovirus vector vaccine and has not been reported at all with the mRNA vaccines. So again, the mRNA vaccines that everyone in the US has access to, they're free, they're effective, and very safe. So again, to come back to the slide, if you had to choose your path to immunity, Natural infection, probably not the best way to go. The illness severity is unpredictable. Young people do die from this. Long-term consequences are not infrequent, at least 1 in 10 people, including young people. And immunity is often not reliable. Particularly with overwhelming infection, you may not form the memory B cells, which are important for long-term immunity. The vaccination route is clearly the easiest route. There's no illness associated because it's not full virus particle or code for full virus. It's just a small sequence of mRNA for the spike that's injected. There's no long-term consequences, at least to 1 year. And immunity appears to be reliable, although obviously we are still early in this pandemic, and we don't know about 2 or 3 year immunity at this point. One important point is that these vaccines may not be that effective in immunocompromised patients because their immune system may not be able to launch an adequate immune response. And it raises the question whether there's a moral obligation to get vaccinated for all workers in the healthcare setting to protect these vulnerable patients. So another question or issue brought up is societal responsibility versus personal rights. We've heard a lot about the right not to get vaccinated, but I would argue that this may not apply in the healthcare setting for the reasons just mentioned, the vulnerability of immunocompromised patients that we see all the time in the healthcare setting. So in summary, we have a highly transmissible disease, COVID-19, with high acute morbidity, where 1 in 80 people either die or end up in the ICU, with frequent serious long-term morbidity that is preventable by a free, extremely effective vaccine with occasional minor, short-lived symptoms and no reported major side effects after 100 million plus treatments. So it seems like a pretty straightforward decision. I would highly recommend everyone get vaccinated, protect yourself, protect others. Thanks for your time.